start now. Those who have RSVP'd, some of them may have decided otherwise, and we will never know until tomorrow. And those who are here, obviously, we need to respect your time, because otherwise we may start losing some of you. What's important is not the numbers, but the quality sometimes. Yes, colleagues, esteemed guests, welcome to this very important engagement, the Indlulamithi Scenarios Event. As the Northwest University, we are a knowledge generation institution. And as such, it is our responsibility to have partners who can assist us in advancing this message in terms of what's the world looking like now, and also how is it likely to look in the future. And this partnership is very crucial in that it locates itself in the NWU Strategy 2024 and beyond, where we're talking about partnerships, growth, diversity, and internationalization. Obviously, we cannot talk about the country, South Africa, without the region, without the continent, and how the continent interacts and links with other continents and the world. Therefore, this is very crucial in determining some of the issues that we are grappling with on a daily basis. I take this opportunity to introduce our guests. We have Prof. Kidiboni Paro, the director in the School of Government Studies. Just you know, so people know you. We have also Prof. Pete Krokamp from the same school, and we have our partners from Indlulamithi Scenarios IP Trust. Or should I just say trust, or just Indlulamithi? That's it. Okay. We have, starting with Ms. Tolelwa Kashe Katia. I hope I have said it correctly. Thank you very much. She is the project leader at the Indlulamithi Scenarios. We have Masero Mafata, who's the office manager, project office manager. You are most welcome. And of course, we have our president here, the SCC, and president of the NWU SRC, Kamoelo Zwane, my president. And we were supposed to have the acting DVC of the Vanderbilt Park campus operations, Prof. Chalufu. Regrettably, he had to go to a doctor. We wish him a speedy recovery, and but he had already sent his message. I'm going to ask Prof. Paro to share the message with us, or the highlights thereof, before we move to the next agenda item. Prof. Paro.
Colleagues, good morning. I also want to stand on the protocol that Mr. Manugu just alluded to in welcoming you here. But I also noticed, colleagues, my colleagues in the school, Professor Lukamba at the back. He's the deputy director in the school based here. Thanks, Prof. And Prof. Costa Hofisi, he's also the director in the AGOPA, the Afrocentric research focus area. Thank you, colleagues, for coming through. Really appreciate it. So, colleagues, I'm reading this in place of Prof. Chalufu. Oh yes, I think Ntate Manuk, we have our student leaders in front, SRC. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're looking forward. In fact, this is a very important talk for the student leadership. And student leadership is not only a question of positioning, but it's also a question of student interest in the matters we are dealing with in the public spaces. So we worked on this, colleagues, with Prof. Chalufu. So he says that once upon a time, there lived a great king who wrote a book about gaining wisdom, about receiving instruction in prudent behavior and doing what is right, what is just, and what is just fair. Among a plethora of words of wisdom that the king imparted were some of the following: the complacency of fools to destroy them. If you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, then you will gain understanding and find the knowledge of God. Program director, before you get worried, so this is not me, so please don't accuse me. It's Prof. Chalufu speaking, I'm reading his speech. Program director, before you get worried, I think that I'm trying to extend Sunday's work into today. As I was catching up on scriptures on a Friday evening flight from Rwanda, I came across the book of Proverbs, which is said to have been written by the great King Solomon. This led me to deep thoughts and reflections about our own country and this engagement that we are having this morning. I thought about how countries like Rwanda have turned the course of events from pain and diversity to immense triumph and success. They chose right, just, and fair path. Allow me to welcome all of you to the Northwest University's Van der Bijl Park campus. Welcome to this auspicious occasion, our seminar on the Indlulamithi Scenarios. Right up front, I want to thank the brains and behind this event, Prof. Pacho, for insisting that we must have this engagement to kickstart a series of thought leadership engagements that we are planning for the future. Universities are spaces for thinking and learning. Thinkers and learners offer a reflective approach to life to understand how to improve or even maximize their impact on society. It is through teaching and learning, our research and innovation, as well as community engagement, that as a university, we nurture the ability to develop and grow ideas that are meaningful and engaging as we attempt to grow and develop our society. Frantz Fanon, in his well-known book, The Wretched of the Earth, puts it in this way that, and I quote, "We coordinate the crystallization of people's innermost aspirations," and I close quote. This means that we attempt to conscientize our minds of our students, staff, and stakeholders on the role to contribute positively to societal affairs, especially for a developmental agenda that is so imperative in our context as South Africa. Colleagues, students, our university is serious and serves this thinking purpose. Thinking provides platforms for innovation and sharing of cutting-edge knowledge and ideas with our stakeholders and partners. The relationships we have with industries such as the National School of Government in the training of public service employees is one such an example that we treat our primary focus in our impactful work on society. Northwest University has partnered with the National School of Government regarding the provision of the Emerging and Advanced Management Development Programs. These programs are designed to offer knowledge on diverse areas necessary for impacting the public service employees in a positive manner. It is through this and other similar collaborative work that we contribute to the development and professionalization of the public sector that seeks to allow the ethical and competent public officials to run our public governance in South Africa. This role helps us to realize and achieve some of the important goals outlined in our National Development Plan, especially the Chapter 13, which outlines areas of focus regarding the building of a capable state in South Africa. Again, through the School of Government Studies, we co-hosted a program for training of senior public officials with the Department of Public Service and Administration, the DPSA, the African Association of Public Administration and Management, APAM, which is based in Nairobi, Kenya, and the Chandler Institute of Governance, which is headquartered in Singapore. This program was attended by senior public officials from over 9 countries on the African continent earlier this year. We engaged on critical topics that sought to support the strengthening of good governance on the African continent as part of our efforts to support African Union's Agenda 2063, which seeks to drive our democracy and a developmental trajectory in a positive way. It is through these kinds of programs and collaborations, ladies and gentlemen, that our role as a university is strengthened in the society to provide ideational tools and services to our short, medium, and long-term aspirations for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to thank you for this opportunity and invite your active participation in today's seminar. We are privileged to have Indlulamithi colleagues who will be presenting the scenarios that seek to provoke and indulge our critical thinking on the future of our country and how we should all take part in shaping and realizing a future we want for ourselves and for our children. A hearty welcome to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Paro, on behalf of Prof. Chalufu, the DVC, Vanderbilt Park campus, and also responsible for student life in the university. We are now going to go straight into the presentation from the colleagues from Indlulamithi Scenarios. Ms. Kashe Katia will lead the presentation. And may I take this opportunity to also acknowledge and welcome those who are joining us online. Thank you very much for joining, and we will have the presentation, after which the president, the SCC chairperson, will respond.
Good morning. Good morning to the student body, and good morning to staff members of the universities that are joining us today and those who are joining us virtually. Thank you, Program Director, and most certainly thank you, Professor Pacho, for the invitation, because Professor Pacho is the first person who actually came up with this idea of us as Indlulamithi coming to engage with the student body, but also staff members of this campus. We do hope that this signifies the beginning of a more long-term relationship and partnership between Indlulamithi SA Scenarios and the University of Northwest, in particular, the School of Government Studies. My name is Xolelwa Kashekatia, is introduced. I'm the project leader of Indlulamithi SA Scenarios. I'm going to, do I need to use the microphone? Oh, you need it for recording. I'm going to be moving around quite a bit in terms of my presentation, and also just to make it a bit more interactive, and I don't want to have my back to my colleagues over here. I have my co-pilot, Masiko, who's going to be joining me because the presentation is quite long. So please bear with us. We do hope that it will be as intriguing as we find it also. But who is Indlulamithi? I mean, this is a multi-stakeholder initiative that began in 2017. You will recall in 2017, it was after the students were out on the streets talking about fees that must fall. We had the nation eventually erupting also, calling for the president of the time to fall. There was a lot of commotion on South African streets at that time and a lot of contestation. And we believe that it was not the first time the country had undergone such moments of rupture or contestation. And even back in the 90s, early 90s, before transition to the democratic dispensation, we had actually developed scenarios to inform which way the country would go after the 1994 election. So it was that made us believe that maybe building scenarios will also be useful for that moment, because it was quite a volatile moment, and it had succeeded before in terms of charting the way forward for the country. Those who were old enough at that time will remember in the 90s there was the Mount Fleur scenarios, which were speaking of ostriches or flight of the flamingos and so on, just to try and determine which way would go after those 1994 elections. So we came full circle, and we believe that we could actually attempt at building a process such as that one, but then we tried to make it more interactive and not just limited to workshops among experts or captains of industry, but to engage with wider society. We engaged with young people, we engaged with the unemployed. We tried to make sure that whoever we're engaging with represented the demographics of the nation. So it is a multi-stakeholder and research-driven initiative. And as I was saying, multi-stakeholder, there are those who are drawn from business, others are coming from academia, government, and so on. So when it started, it was just a loose collaboration. But as of 2022, we've since formalized, and now we've got an institution with board members. We're registered as a trust, because we do believe that every now and again the country would need to undergo a process of scenarios, because others have happened after those 1994 scenarios. We've had the presidential scenarios, we've had the Dino King scenarios, so that's why we've decided to institutionalize, so that every now and again we refresh and tell these stories about the future of South Africa. So this is not a way of predicting what the future would look like. As we're saying, it's research driven. So there's a particular methodology that we follow. But I'll just recap on the last scenarios that we did when we launched in 2018 at that time, after all these ruptures. We had a scenario called Naila Walk, which is a nation that's walking together. And I mean, as young people, you would relate to some of these, the naming. We try to make it attractive to young people, but by using dance moves. And South Africans also, we quite the leaders globally when it comes to dance and dance trends and dance moves. So we had Naila Walk, which is a dance move that you do as a group. If you're doing it alone, like Codesa for the older generation, or Bus Stop, if you're doing it alone, it doesn't look as nice. But if you're doing it as a group, then you start seeing the choreography. So this is a nation that's walking together, choreographed in carefully managed steps. The second one was Isibujwa, another dance move, but in Isibujwa, those who are communists in the room, I think in the student leadership would know bourgeois nation, which actually is a reflection of a nation that's more divided than the current South Africa, wherein you have the elite, and then you have the very poor, with nothing in between. The middle class is completely eroded, and there's divisions across all realities as a society. So that was a bourgeois nation. And then Gwara was the last one. The third scenario, which was a floundering false dawn. This is a state of lawlessness, much like the dance move, which is a bit erratic, and one leg is fixed and the other one is moving vigorously. So the Gwara nation is a state of lawlessness, wherein we have shadow states forming, especially at a municipal level, and absolutely no consequences from the zone, what would have been the Zondo Commission. Because remember, we wrote this in 2018, it was before the Zondo Commission. And because of the lack of consequences, then key state institutions, they get recaptured in that scenario. So after going around the country in 2018, after launching these scenarios, everyone, like we were having sessions such as this ones where we're talking to different people, telling them these stories. And then they said, hey, how about you continue with your work and not just tell the stories, but measure which way the country is going so that every year you can tell us whether we're in Gwara Gwara or Naile Walk and so on. That's when the Indlulamithi barometer was born. And the barometer, as you can see, from 2019, it showed that there was an expression, or a huge expression of that state of lawlessness, which is Gwara Gwara, a little bit of isiBourgeois, and very little expression of Naile Walk, where we're walking together. And then over the years, year on year, you could see how the Gwara Gwara nation is being intensified. And then came the COVID years. 2021, we started seeing some of our indicators in the Gwara Gwara behaving in ways that were even worse than that, because this is the worst case scenario. So we started seeing things that are even worse than what we had measured when we were writing the stories. And that's when we called those GG+. And as you can see, by 2023, last year, when we released the last result, the extent of the GG+ at 41%, 18% just the normal Gwara Gwara, so making that about 59%, which is way past the midline, showing that the majority of South Africans' realities are that of a state of lawlessness, with recapturing of institutions, you know, daily protests and so on. So, I mean, the biggest pull to this, I'll show you now why we were getting deeper and deeper into barometer, into the Gwara Gwara nation. Because the barometer is composed by the key drivers of the scenarios, and we had identified the key drivers to be resistance and resentment. And this, we got it in particular from young people, wherein there was this wrangling over the Constitution. Others believe that the Constitution works for us, and others feel like it works for only the elite. But also there's this resentment and this woundedness that seems intergenerational, and it is informed by the scars of the past, the apartheid colonial past that is still not resolved. So that's why then you find that there was that resentment, which was a key driver. The second key driver was institutional capacity and leadership. And here it's not just institutional leadership in government. It could be at university, it could be among student leadership, it could be in our churches, it could be in our homes, it could be in big business. I mean, we've seen big companies that have also been accused of unethical behavior at leadership level. So the country as a whole is suffering from this issue of institutional capacity. Then there's social inequality. And again, it's not just inequality in terms of how much we earn, material means of inequality, but it's about race, it's about gender, it's about class, it's about age even, wherein we find that there's all these different inequalities in our country. And as a result of that, we would then measure all the indicators that are linked to those key drivers. And what we found is that what took us to the barometer, when we looked at all the 54 indicators, what took us to Gwara Gwara was actually the inequality. As you can see here, where you've got the longest green bar is where inequality is concerned. So the conclusion is that because of our inequality, that's why we are in this state of lawlessness, as revealed by the barometer since 2019 up to 2023. So because of this result, we felt that it was important to actually refresh the scenarios and write a new set of scenarios, which is what we're going to be telling you today. Because, you know, it was clear that we're in Gwara Gwara nation, so where to from here? Also, back then, state capture was the context, and we're dealing with issues of social cohesion and hence the divisions. Can we ever find each other as South Africans? That is the key question. You know, can we find social cohesion by 2030? We use 2030 as the marker, because when you write scenarios, you have to have a horizon. So we're looking at 2030. We chose 2030 deliberately because of the National Development Plan, but also because of the SDGs of the United Nations also have, you know, 2030 as their horizon. But now in these new scenarios, we felt that maybe we need to push the horizon further, because when you write scenarios, the future has to be a bit further than what you can imagine right now. So we moved from 2030 to 2035, But also we had to consider things like the pandemic, because it was clear in the last barometer that during the pandemic, a lot of things became intensified, like the inequality. It was expressed even more, it was felt even more during those COVID years. So we had to look at pandemics, not just COVID, because pandemics have always been with us, it's just that we thought they would never hit us. So we had to engage with people who work in the health system, professionals there, researchers, but also we had to consider the geopolitical shifts. We do know that China is becoming the strongest economy. There's an eastward shift in terms of the politics, but also in terms of the economy, world economies. Like everything is going eastwards now. It used to be the West that was dominant. And South Africa is quite entangled with those shifts. If you were to look at the conflict in Ukraine, South Africa had a lot to say there. If you were to look at even Palestinian issue, South Africa is involved. So it was very important for us to pay attention to those geopolitical shifts. But another thing is that there was like all these ruptures that continued. When we started, we were talking about fees must fall, Zuma must fall, and now we've even had that rioting that took place in 2021, and it had a huge impact in KZN and in parts of Gauteng. And then there was the election this year. So all those things were put into consideration as we're writing the scenarios we're going to be sharing with you today. But before we get there, it's just to communicate to you that what we're looking at was the question of what would South Africa look like in 2035. So that's the key question. So when you start any scenarios process, you always have to have a question in your mind, and then you put the horizon. So now it's no longer 2030, but it's 2035. And I'm going to invite Masiko to take us through the methodology while I take a short break, just in terms of how then we build the scenarios.
Thank you, Olola, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. As Olola mentioned, my name is Masiko Mafata, and I'm going to be talking you through the methodology. So Olola's given you a picture of, how we got into scenario planning, our first iteration of scenarios, measuring where the country was in relation to that iteration of scenarios, releasing the barometer, and then realizing that the country was in a state that exceeded our initial scenarios, and that forced us to then think about refreshing our scenarios, which led to the development of the 2035 scenarios. But how did we do that? So at Indlulamithi, we use a research-based methodology that is also highly consultative. So the methodology that we used is called the Intuitive Logic School. And this methodology combines evidence-based research and creative insights of experts. So experts are people from different sectors of society, your health experts, your policy experts, your education experts. Any sector that you can think of, we've probably consulted an expert in that area. So once we've gotten a hold of these experts, we try and push them to imagine a future that's worse or better than their current reality. So that's the crux of the Intuitive Logic School. So in our sessions with these experts, we have interviews, we have focus groups, and we ask them a variety of questions that have to do with imagining a future that's either worse or much better than their current reality. And once we've conducted all these interviews, we distill the key points that people make into variables. So statements such as, comments on the state of the economy or comments on the state of health, you start to find that people are making similar comments. They may not always be using the same words, but they're speaking to the same thing. So we group these comments into variables, and once we've got all our variables, so for this set of scenarios, we had 26 variables. Once we had all 26 variables, we invited our reference group. Our reference group consists of the experts that we interviewed during the initial research part of the process. So we invite our reference group, and we sit with them and we rank the scenarios in order of impact and uncertainty. The variables, sorry. We rank them in order of impact and uncertainty. So you can imagine if the certainty of something is, predictable and the impact is not that great, you're not really stressing so much about that thing. Whereas if something that you're quite unsure about the uncertainty and the impact of that event and the likelihood that it occurs could be, quite big, that's something that you're heavily concerned about. So that's kind of how we mapped out our variables. As you can see in the quadrants that we have here, we've got high uncertainty, high impact, low uncertainty, and low impact. So the key quadrant that we focused on was the quadrant that looks at high uncertainty and high impact. So those are variables that, we don't know, we're not certain about their likelihood, but in the event that they do happen, they could have a great impact on our society, on the direction that our country follows. So after ranking our variables, before I go on to after ranking our variables, I can tell you about some of the variables that came up in the highly uncertain and highly impactful quadrant. So we had variable number 3, which was democratic institutions and procedures largely remaining valued by South Africans, but facing continued risks to their protection. So this was something that people in the focus groups and interviews expressed a concern about. We had people expressing a concern about South Africa experiencing a deepening fiscal crisis, people expressing a concern about the economy and livelihoods remaining impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, with an expansion of the informal economy and a need for a rebuilding of cultural and other institutions, a concern around the adherence to the present economic framework failing to generate growth and employment, and thus resulting in the persistence of poverty and inequality. And lastly, people expressed a concern about the state facing a continued crisis of weak leadership, making it difficult for decisions and policies decisions to be taken and decisions to be driven by policies. So once we had, this list of 26 variables and we ranked them in order of impact and certainty, we grouped them into 3 categories, which we called key driving forces, right? So these key driving forces form the basis of our scenario stories, which Olelo will take you through. Our first key driving force for this set of scenarios was a low economic growth trap. So within this key driving force, we listed all the variables that were related to a low economic growth trap. So that first one, a present economic framework failing to generate growth, you saw that as one of our highly impactful and highly uncertain variables. The one on the economy and livelihoods remaining impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, it's a highly uncertain, highly impactful variable. And then some other variables that we had under this key driving force were emerging technologies and innovations not being maximized, those opportunities not being maximized or managed for benefit of all, thus deepening a digital divide. And then we also have a South Africa where economic fortunes remain dependent on global geopolitics and international diplomatic and trade relations. So you can notice that most of these variables present a negative view, but there is one positive one, which is at the same time a conducive environment for business, cultivates expansion of new businesses and promotes investment. I'm emphasizing this point because often when we present scenarios, people think there's like one really bad scenario and then one really good scenario, and we all just want to move towards the really good scenario. But that's not necessarily how it works, right? That's not how society works. That's not how life works. Scenarios are nuanced. There are some good things in a really bad scenario, and there are some bad things in a really good scenario. So even within a low economic growth trap, which is considered to be a negative thing, there is kind of a positive that happens there with the environment being conducive for business expansion. Our second key driving force for this set of scenarios was a state weakness and declining accountability. So some of the variables that we listed in this key driving force were the state facing a continued crisis of weak leadership, state institutions and the provision of public services disintegrating, with weak municipal government capacity being felt by citizens. We have democratic institutions and procedures remaining valued but facing continued risks to their protection. We have a declining accountability and social responsibility of the private sector, limiting partnerships for collective good. We have a culture of corruption and unaccountability that undermines the collective project for a common good and emphasizing the need for strong ethical leadership to emerge. And lastly, we have politics being driven by party politics and rivalries rather than policies and solutions. Our final key driving force for this set of scenarios was around internal security being threatened by anger, distrust, and factors such as resistance to renewal. So the variables that fell into this key driving force included a continued high rate of youth unemployment, making the youth alienated and socially dislocating them. We have continued anger and distrust, and violence in society persisting, a rise in identity politics with a high probability of continued social unrest. We have historic trauma and depth of woundedness impacting national cohesion, psychological well-being, and the institution of the family. Our society remains fractured without space and political will to build social cohesion. And we have a society where even though civil society tries to hold the state to account, they're not meaningfully included, especially the voices and perspectives of the youth, and this increases people's passivity and disengagement from what's happening around them. We have immigration control and the intra-regional migration of people remaining contentious. And again, as we have, in present times, we have migrants facing continued vulnerability and scapegoating. We have a lack of progress on land reform and restitution, which again is something that we're living with in current times. And then we also have an ANC that's still characterized by intra-party conflict and factionalism, which again, something we're living with in current times. So those are our key driving forces, and as I mentioned, they inform the development of the scenarios that Olela will be taking you through now.
Thank you so much, Masiko, for that. And I know that was we had to give you a bit more about the methodology, because sometimes people wonder how we get to these stories, that we're telling. So that is the logic behind it, the intuitive logic. So it's a lot of gut feel and intuition. But once we gather that intuitive insight, then we would go and conduct research, commission papers, so that we've got a deeper understanding of all these things we're talking about here. So these key driving forces were then mixed together, take key driving force 1 and 3, play around with it, and then try and create a narrative towards 2035. And I'm happy that today the audience is very young, because everywhere whenever we present these scenarios, and I get to the slide where I say, deadline is December 2035, and usually in the room, people will be like, oh, I'll probably be dead by then. But today, we are speaking to people, an audience that is most likely going to be around then, so it is really your future. So imagine it is December 2035, it's not 2024. If you were to cast your mind to 2035, there's climate change, it's become real. We know climate change is here to stay. It's become a huge reality. It impacts on food security, that we're struggling to ensure that households are fed in 2035 because of climate change. There's pandemics globally. So if you thought that pandemic of 2020 was the last time we experienced a pandemic, think again. They've become a reality, and they're regular, and they're becoming more deadly. Then there's uneven benefits from artificial intelligence. We do know that technology is here to stay also, and there's lots of benefits, but because of inequalities, it's uneven how we get access or make use of technology. But also, again, this eastward shift. In 2035, China is the #1 economy, and India is #4. In terms of South Africa, where do we fit into this whole global, reality of 2035? By 2035, South Africa's population has increased to 70 million people. But a quarter of South African population lives in rural, areas compared to half that was back in the 1990s. 2/3 of the population live in 3 provinces: Gauteng, Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal. So things have not changed since the 2020s when people were living there. That's the first story. I hope you can hear the sound. You all know that bird, right? The Hadeda. You don't like it. You hate it. You wake up, it's in your yard. It looks threatening with that huge beak, and it's quite huge. It's bigger than a chicken at times. You feel like it could actually attack you and poke your eye out. These are Africa's largest and loudest birds, rather. They are good foragers. They usually follow human settlement patterns. They used to be coastal, but the more we moved inland, they followed us. They're always screaming in the morning, and we don't know if the sound is threatening, is the danger real, or is it perceived danger. So this is what we've called the first scenario, which is one possibility of which way the country would go. We could become a Hadeda nation, which is loud, or it could be okay, I think I skipped something then. So in the Hadeda home, what happens? This is a recrimination nation, where when you recrimination, we're blaming everybody, and it's a very noisy democracy, noisier than it is right now. We do know that we've got a very noisy democracy. You've seen how our parliament, is set up, and the noise that comes from there. In the recrimination nation, South Africans retreat and they pull closer to those they regard as their own. So there isn't that mixing. We protect those we love and those that look like us and those that we can relate to. So we cluster in enclaves, and if you're rich enough, you can actually protect your own people by buying private armadas to protect you. We know we started that with the estates. If you're from Gauteng, you know that there's a proliferation of those where people are moving into these enclaves. But people are generally on the edge in the Hadeda home. The economy, yes, it's spluttering along, but women continue to bear the brunt of poverty and violence in South Africa. In terms of governance, political parties are now distrusted by 70% of the population in 2035. We knew that in the 2020s there was already the distrust that was showing up, but also people now no longer trust the courts. And in the 2020s, there was this idea that the courts can still remain trusted, but not in the Hadeda home. There's a centrist social democratic coalition that governs South Africa in the Hadeda home. Now, just to pause here, in all 3 scenarios, there's coalition governments. We released these in November last year. It was before May 2024, and many did not believe, especially those in the current coalition now, that there would ever be coalitions. But we said the future of South Africa is in coalition government. So all 3 stories that I'm going to tell today have got a type of coalition government. So in this one, it's centrist social democratic coalition. But everything is negotiated, via these backroom deals, because they don't really trust each other, but they are forced into a coalition. There's an unjust transition to renewable energy that is actively resisted, and it also benefits those who are closer to the centers of power. Speed up is the cry from the citizens. However, the slogans from this coalition or GNU are that better tomorrow. There's very little gain from this eastward shift. So with China becoming the biggest economy, South Africa gains very little, even though, remember, in the 20s when we were there in the BRICS before it became BRICS Plus, you also remember when South Africa used to lead the conversation on a multipolar world, but then we are left behind in this Hadeda nation. Over time, AGOA benefits are also restricted. AU, the African Union, is also faction-driven, weak. There's coups everywhere. Political stability has allowed some countries to grow. So we have countries such as Namibia, Botswana, Kenya, Mauritius, who are also now starting to do much better than South Africa. There's a skillful deployment of the Belt and Road Initiative by China, but it undercuts South Africa's standing with African neighbors. There's a steady erosion of South Africa's defense capability. In terms of climate change, higher temperatures are erratic, there's erratic rainfall, and this impacts on the cost of food. South Africa has to now import its wheat. Large farms are somewhat buffered, but and there's some increase in jobs in the agricultural sector. There's slow economic growth that remains unresolved in the Hadeda home. After 20 years struggle, Eskom is finally protected from criminals, Transnet to a certain extent, but private entities and municipalities also, galvanize to contribute to the grid through active self-procurement power. And as privately owned green and gas generations use SOE's core infrastructure effectively. So this collaboration or contribution by the private sector somewhat helps, even though this recrimination is very loud and contested, but there are some wins where energy is concerned. Transnet has been recapitalized twice, and this is through the BRICS loans from India. In terms of the economy, we've only managed to add 3 million jobs, even though the population is 70 million in the Hadeda nation. Unemployment rate is still above 37%, youth unemployment around 55%. Even though we have huge platinum group metal reserves, we're still not able to, exploit them effectively to contribute to the grid, but also to, improve on our standing economically. But in terms of young people, they do use artificial intelligence to opt out because there's nothing that the government will be able to do for them. So they volunteer and they build productive lives despite this weak economy. Now, in terms of education, we know we've got a dual education system. We see the increase of using artificial intelligence in education, but it does very little to improve the prospects of most young South Africans. There's all these pseudo-private schools that are out there for the poor to exploit, but those are fly-by-nights in general. And only little over half of those who started matric in 2024 actually matriculate by 2035. So basically, the Hadedas have come home to roost. We still have apartheid special planning that is enduring. We still have the highest HIV burden. We can't even afford to buy the medications that are made available because of these backroom dealings by the coalition government that is ruling over South Africa. There's gatekeepers, rent seekers, petty power officials that are widely and correctly blamed by society. Half-hearted reforms, poor implementation has led to this disillusionment by society, but basically the buck stops nowhere. We blame each other, we blame the blacks, we blame the whites, we blame apartheid, colonialism, the foreigners. The blame game is the order of the day, and it's loud and it's noisy, just like the Hadedas. Maybe the youth will change things with artificial intelligence and technology, but that is still just a maybe. Now we move on to the second scenario, which is the vulture culture. Can listen and hear the vultures, they're feeding. So we know vultures love a feast. They are very, very skilled scavengers. So this is a scavenging nation that scavenges itself, but also it has other scavengers outside. These are skilled scavengers, vultures. They fast, they soak in, they can push everyone else of those other scavengers for what they regard as theirs. So imagine a South Africa that is behaving like vultures. That's scenario 2. Okay. In this scenario, South Africans are more united than ever, but against their government. Now, in this scenario, the coalition government is authoritarian, and it is populist, and it's heavy-handed on its citizens. Growth has stalled, this fiscal catastrophe that is imminent. More than half the adults in South Africa are jobless. 1/3 of South Africans go to bed hungry at least once a week. There are no-go areas because criminal syndicates have taken over, even where government is supposed to be leading. As a result, desperate South Africans leave the country in droves to a point where the biggest export of South Africa is its own citizens. How did we get here? Remember that coalition of 2024, which was sort of like a liberal right of center? Well, it became heavy-handed against crime, because crime back in the 2020s was the biggest challenge, but the heavy-handedness backfired because then government became heavy-handed against its own citizens, and the citizens then were not too happy. We also see criminal syndicates and crime bosses taking over the space. Populist parties eventually leave this coalition and they form another coalition that exploits this desperation and this anger amongst citizens. In the provinces, these authoritarian coalitions, they start becoming more prominent, and the cry at the 2029 election is that there's this the return to traditional values. In terms of South Africa and the world in this vulture culture, the West still remains as a vital part of our economy. However, there's increased protectionism and tariff wars break out. China remains South Africa's main BRICS trading partner in the vulture culture. However, South Africans struggle with the reality that, in the 2030s, we are only a minor player in the BRICS Plus formation. Relations with the African Union have become frosty to a point where the African Union starts questioning the integrity of South Africa's 2034 election. Imagine that, where the AU is now saying that election was not free and fair. South Africa is no longer the front runner of the African seat in the United Nations Security Council. In terms of the climate, temperatures rise as expected. Ice caps melt. There's bushfires everywhere. Pollution intensifies. But also there's droughts and seasonal rainfall, and we know that South Africa already was a water-scarce country already by the 2020s. Unemployment has become deeply entrenched in the vulture culture. Half of all unemployment South Africans have never had a job in their lives. The only major employment opportunities that South Africans can find is employment within the state, and as a result, the fiscal purse gets eroded because more than 2.5 million employees are dependent on the public purse. There's collusions between unions and employers, and as a result, organizations such as the CCMA and NEDLEC also become eroded. Rating agencies, they downgrade South Africa to the C's and the D's. 25% of South Africans are poorer than they were in the 2020s. Now, in terms of health, NHI in this vulture culture is still a mirage. And it actually impacts mostly on the, those who work within the health sector, and they also start leaving in droves because then it impacts on them. 5 years on, the system now risks complete collapse. That is by 2035. It's near collapse. That's the NHI. New HIV medications are available globally, but we still cannot afford them. Before the and also before the designated foreign funded entities, they were banned in South Africa by 2033. And it's this idea of foreign interference within even the health system. As a result, South Africans' average life expectancy, it stalls in the vulture culture. Now, in terms of criminality, the criminal syndicates have become, more systematic. In the 2020s, it was erratic, and they were not as systematic. They were a bit disorganized. But now, because of the reduced capacity of the state, we find criminal syndicates, taking form. Remember those construction mafias we had in the 2020s? Now they have spread to every single sector, not just construction, where now you've got mafias everywhere, whether it's water mafia or food mafia or what have you, where there's government tender involved, you will find some kind of mafia there operating in the ways that the construction mafia was operating Kidnappings for ransom increase dramatically. They become order of the day that you and I can also be kidnapped. You don't have to be a high net worth individual to be kidnapped. The judicial system also becomes overwhelmed because this coalition government is forever taking each other to court, and as a result, the judicial system is unable to serve the ordinary citizens. And vultures feel able to act with impunity because of this. Now, living in the vulture culture as a South African, by 2035, that coalition exploited other, parties' weaknesses, one of which was the heavy-handedness against crime, and it ruthlessly closed down the democratic space. So all the rights that you would have had in the 20s, like the right to freedom and so on, they shut down in the vulture culture. There's even a Foreign Interference Act which shuts down many prominent NGOs who are accused of foreign funding, and especially where journalism is concerned. The SABC management and channels are faithful hounds of government. They spew out whatever government is barking as orders. SOE boards are also stacked with this ruling coalition party's allies. South Africans leave in droves, but also even those African experts who used to come to South Africa thinking of it as a better place also start questioning whether South Africa is actually a destination of choice. So it's no longer a desired destination even by migrants. For ordinary South Africans, life is hard by 2035 in the vulture culture nation, and that's because the vultures got there first. So now we move on to the third scenario, which is the weavers. The certain weaver birds. I mean, these are, I think, the president's favorite birds lately. When he spoke about our scenarios, he really amplified this weaver nation, that we're creating weaver nation, and I think also John Steenhuisen also has been carrying on about the weaver nation. And why do they like these birds? Because these are very industrious birds. They're tiny, but they build these perfect nests. I think you've seen some of them, they fall off and they're like very perfect and cylindrical. And what we've learned about these birds is that they use those as, mating, in terms of mating rituals, where you build a house for your prospective partner. And if she thinks it's not perfect, then the bird would tear it down and then rebuild another one. So that's how, and they also live in communities where these nests, you'd find lots of them, about 10 in one tree. But also the Kalahari weavers that we reference in this scenario, they build massive nests that can house hundreds and hundreds of bird families. So these are bounce-back birds. They're tiny, but they're sociable, they collaborate, they work in groups, they live in groups, they raise the young ones as groups. However, in everyone talking about the weaver birds who have become very popular, what they did not read of our slides was this first one, where actually how is this weaver nation cultivated? From the mid-2020s, we saw an indecisive new government that rose, and it was indecisive, it could not stall, the economic challenges. And despite some improvements in Eskom's power, performance supply, and stabilization of Transnet, the anger was growing in society because there were no consequences and there was still, very little implementation. It got to a point where all the ruptures that we've been witnessing, they culminate into a massive rupture where the whole nation rises up in protest. So people are hard for. There's wave after wave of marches. If you would to see, I think you guys are not here in the 80s, maybe some here on stage were there, but if you were to look at footage of the 80s movement where everyone was out on the streets to, actually challenge the ruling National Party government, and something similar happens here. But this anger is also channeled into creativity. We start seeing young people leading these movements, there's other social movements, creative industries, all the artists are also coming out, they're producing music and visual arts and productions that are actually serving to challenge the status quo. So that anger now has become, the creativity has also become protest. So the whole of society moves into protest mode. And then as a result, a broad coalition emerges out of that. And it emerges, and it's through collaboration, that coalition that rises by 2029. It's because it's supposed to be a listening coalition that is cooperative, and it also draws its leadership from civil society, youthful movements, faith-based movements, and so on. And business also starts investing in this because they can see that this movement is actually growing, and as a result, government is now forced to listen. So the fiercely contested 2034 election also sees like these major parties in this coalition improving, that it actually establishes itself as the coalition to take the country forward. In terms of power and governance, there's this growing spirit of active citizenship, and it was a result of those protests when the country moved to protest mode, that now there's this sense of a participation and being more active as citizens. Government sets up cooperative structures with civil society to address grievances, even though change is slow, but something is happening. High hopes that were dashed, people were defined, mobilizing across all sectors. There's genuine political competition that rises the game of all political parties in the Weaver nation. And after the 2034 election, we see three major parties forming a Concord agreement, which is another coalition, but one that proves to be stable and focused and promises to listen to the people, and has demonstrated over the past 5 years that it does listen to the people. And as government improves, government is able to convince even the world that now you can come back to South Africa and invest here. Trust sips back into its global ranking, so we start improving even on that front as a nation. In terms of South Africa and the world, we've managed to strike a better balance between our participation in the BRICS formation and others, so that stance of non-alignment is even more pronounced and more emphasized. Through BRICS, we leverage the BRICS Plus to strengthen regional parks, and it also influences our participation within the African Continental Free Trade Area. South Africa vies with Kenya, Mauritius, and other nations to be an entry point into African markets. After BRICS expansion, we also start focusing on the OIRA states, which is the Indian Ocean Rim Association. In terms of climate change, we know that even here, climate change is still there. We far exceed the Paris cap. South Africa spearheads the African Union's food security plans, because we've got a strengthened and emboldened coalition government there. Government enforces more sustainable water use. After 2031, there was even greater investment in water and sanitation infrastructure. Government-supported ventures by universities and agricultural research institutes, and that also helps in terms of agriculture, developing new strains of grain and so on. And our famed resilience, that South African famed resilience, actually spurs growth within the informal sector as well. And between 2024 and 2029, we see government shoring up Eskom and accelerating its private power production here again. And government allows municipalities and private companies to actually contribute to the grid with the help of the private sector. Transnet's freefall is also arrested. Eskom is able to shut down some of its coal-fired power stations, Kendal, Letabo, and Matimba. And there's this steep decrease in crime within the Weaver work. Tourism is boosted because of the reduced crime, so it becomes more attractive to come and visit South Africa, even for South Africans to travel, because of the ways in which this coalition has managed crime. Tourism and related industries ramped up direct contribution to the GDP. So here, it's in the Weaver nation, agriculture, tourism are the sectors that actually take the country forward. But also, this coalition government starts focusing more on the youth, with the National Youth Service Act being passed in 2031, and this enables young people to go and contribute to various sectors. So it sort of like resembles the conscription of the apartheid government, but that was military, but this one is not military. It goes beyond even the medical sector, where, you know, students in medicine would go and do community service. So if you to imagine this happening across all sectors, so it becomes a requirement, and youth are placed in service teams with other South Africans from different backgrounds, and through that, there's a way that you know, the divide between rural and urban is actually now reduced. And also companies start looking for youth service participation to actually, when they're looking at CVs and considering employing young people. And as automation takes over, routine tasks such like in the workplace are also, you know, taken over by that. Just lastly, the last slide. So this Concord Coalition, you know, it also bolstered investigative and intelligence gathering capacity of the SIU. So we see here Hawks and prosecuting authorities actually ensuring that there are consequences to those who have, you know, broken the law. We have special courts that are set up to deal with people with expertise in financial crimes. And South Africa, as a result, starts enjoying 7 fat years after 2028, wherein we see increased growth, recovery, and increased employment. And getting there required this collaboration between, you know, the investment by business that we mentioned, but also a government that listens, and this legitimacy of civil society, youthful groups, artists who all took the country forward. So that collaboration is what actually gave birth to this Weaver work. And South Africans in this Weaver work seem more determined to make the country and nation work. And really, there's many unsung heroes in this Weaver nation. Many grassroots leaders that ensured that it happens, to a point where South Africans believe by end of 2035 that 2036 might be the best year ever. So that's the end of the scenarios. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for that presentation. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the program director, Mr. Manoko, our director in the School of Governance, the professors that are available today. I'm seeing my lecturer, so Prof. Lukamba and Prof. Costa, and our partners, Indlulamithi and Prof. Grokamp. Thank you for this wonderful initiative, and thank you to the School of Governance for actually arranging such an initiative so that we can be able to exchange knowledge and get knowledge. I'm sitting down there and I'm like, yeah, we have to school ourselves in terms of what is going to happen in the near future and where we are going. It is very important. I would like to also acknowledge the students that are here. I'm seeing a lot of political science and public administration students, and I'm seeing other students as well. Thank you for availing yourselves. Student leaders, welcome. My name is Kamohelo Zwane. I'm the current serving SEC chairperson and the SRC president. In what I've been learning when I am sitting down, I've picked up that these are projections and the findings that are done by the organization based on where we are going and where we are currently. To be honest, we are a country that is ongoing and it's growing bit by bit. However, we haven't met our objective when it comes to meeting the SDGs and the National Development Plan of 2030. That I'm talking about the innovation part, quality education, partnership for the goals to be achieved, and I'm mentioning the strong institutions. When it comes to strong institutions, we speak about what makes them to be strong. It was mentioned in one of the scenarios that we have weak leadership. In so doing that, and that this is applicable nationally as well. So for us to actually meet those goals and to actually meet some of the positive projections that are done by the organization, we need to start working on having our leadership to be actually what is needed for us to achieve whatever that we want to achieve in the next 5 to 10 years. I will go straight to the scenarios because I was told to respond. Okay. Then we saw with the first scenario, which is the Hadeda home, the recrimination nation. What took most of my attention was the governance part, whereby our people, us as South Africans, we no longer have trust to the government. We have lost trust to the governance of South Africa. Hence, in the third scenario, it does state that, the third scenario, it does state that people are tired, people are hurtful, and that actually equates us to actually start marching and striking. I was in Rwanda a few days, and one thing that they mentioned the most is that their student leadership will never strike for anything. They do not strike. What does this mean, and what does this tell us as part of the student exchange program? The only answer that they gave before we could give an answer, they said, because you apply this nationally, everything that we get in South Africa is due to us protesting. For us to get the services and the services to be provided to us, we have to raise our voices in the streets. Therefore, what can we come up with as a solution that the future leaders and the future community and the future society does not subscribe to such? We need to be innovative enough. As part of this sustainable development goals, we need to infuse innovation. We need to apply, I think it's scenario 3, in terms of in terms of changes and improvements. We need to gain our confidence back to the government by having what? By influencing the policies of our own government. It was mentioned in scenario number 2 that the participation of youth, I think it's scenario number 2, yes. The participation of youth, the voices of young people are not heard in our communities. Part of my research is youth participation in communities and decision makings. Without the youth that we are today, there will never, ever be improvement in our government, because the same youth that is sitting today here is the government of tomorrow. Therefore, if we keep on taking from what we see today, then definitely the trust of the government will always not be met. We can never meet the government's trust, by the way. So these projections, they teach us a lot as we are sitting down there, that research is important. Being active is also important. The scenarios that are presented today, they teach us that in South Africa in the next 10 years, 5 to 10 years, it will be a different South Africa. However, unemployment still remains a problem, especially youth unemployment. We have seen that almost 68% in 2035 will be youth unemployment. Therefore, we need to make sure that innovatively we come through. Our government must make amends in infusing the innovation that we have. We live in the information revolution society. We live in a community whereby everything is evolving. Therefore, the youth must be involved and the youth must take part of whatever innovation that is going to come with different institutions. In part of, I'm going to come at home, which is the Northwest University. Part of the strategy, it's transformation and internalization. It was mentioned that due to global shifts, most trades are moving out of South Africa. We are facing low economic growth because now what we need to do is that we need to transform our societies. What we need to do is that we need to make sure that the societies that we live in, we are transforming them so we can be able to meet those goals. It is not a secret to all of us that poor service delivery is a problem for us in South Africa. However, the government has made a massive improvement in terms of ESCOM. However, it is mentioned that there's still more improvement to be done. I'm writing notes everywhere and it's actually, I'm going to come to the coalition government. When it comes to the coalition government, I was told, we had one of the classes and our prof was like, are you aware that Party B and Party A are going to get married in May? And we're like, no, that will never happen. And because of education, because of knowledge, that actually happened. Therefore, the projections that are done there, that were presented to us, it's a matter of us as students, governance students, and students from other professions, to actually go and do our research based on that. The coalition government, for now, it's bringing good initiatives. The ESCOM is improving, more accountability is taken, and there's transparency in some form of governments, especially in local and provincial governments. Therefore, this proves that with the coalition government, there is one step ahead that the South African government needs. However, we still have a long way to go because now there is interference of politics in our administration in South Africa. That's why there are now factions and disagreements in the leading party. Therefore, what we need to do is that we need to make sure that whatever that the government presents to us, it is what we take so that we can meet the SDG goals and the 2035 plans. Thank you, Mr. Manoko.
As we're sitting there at the back, I couldn't hear what anybody says. Luckily, I could read the slides, but I couldn't hear. So if I repeat something that somebody else has said, get up and tell me so. Scenarios, it's been coming a long time. For many decades, we've designed and developed scenarios about South Africa. And it is a really, really difficult art because the question is always, if you see there's an algorithm, which variables do you include in the algorithm? Because we will all disagree about which ones to include. And then once we've included the X number, the relationship between those variables, how do we understand it? And what do we want to make of those relationships between those variables? It is a really, really difficult thing to do. And I have a lot of admiration for people who do get it right. But I think it is difficult to get it right. And you may, in 2035, you may end up with a reality that includes a little bit of each and every one of these scenarios. And that we are not necessarily in a position where we could say that we had been able to predict. Remember, a scenario is not a prediction, it just maps a particular reality. But we weren't able to really envisage the future, is perhaps the better word, because it is really, really difficult. But I'm in the business of change. I think we need to change things. And I think we have evidence that we can change things, and we can change it for the better. I'm going to give you one or two examples of how we changed things in the past for the better. Under the presidency of Thabo Mbeki, the economy grew between 4.5% and 5.5% at times. The reality is, there is no alternative to economic growth, to empower people, to employ people, to create wealth, to allow people to send their children to good schools, to allow people to enter the logistics systems by having their own car, their own vehicle, and to free people from the shackles of poverty. There is only one answer: economic growth. We need more money. We need more money earned by people, multiplied by productive people. There is no alternative scenario. We've mentioned China, for instance. China was the one country that lifted about 300 million people in absolutely no time, in a decade, out of poverty into the middle class. And today they are the biggest middle class in the whole world. They have 1.4 billion people, 400 million people middle class. That's bigger than the whole American population. The only problem is 1 billion people in China still earns the salary of the average person in Nigeria. How will they ever deal with that problem? 1 billion people still earn the average salary of the average person in Nigeria. Okay, Thabo Mbeki got South African economy with Trevor Manuel to grow between 4.5% and 5.5%. During those years, 9 million people became employed. The black middle class tripled. Suddenly, and we had no black middle class. Apartheid destroyed the black family and the black middle class. Suddenly, under Thabo Mbeki, we created the black middle class who earned property, earned assets, earned capital, had access to capital, had access to good education, had access to medical health. A black middle class was created under Thabo Mbeki by economic growth. South Africa can be governed well. It is possible for the economy to grow. It is possible for us to all be better off in 5 or 6 or 7, 9 years from now, if we can get the economy to grow. Of course, economic growth is undermined by a lack of trust in institutions, a lack of trust in society, a lack of the behavior of society, a lack of trust in government, all those things, and we can turn that around. Let me give you another example. In 2016, the post office was on the brink of a complete collapse in South Africa. Complete collapse. They closed post office, they fired people. Every year they asked government for a bailout. Government then got the wisdom to appoint an investment banker to post office. 4 years later, post office had 56% more assets, value in assets and in capital. The next year, there was the first time in almost a decade that they wouldn't have asked government for a bailout, the treasury, for an annual bailout like almost all of the other 700 SOEs have been asking for. This CEO who has turned this institution around and has started to modernize it, picked up a trouble with the minister, Pravin Gordhan, and he was let go. 4 years later, 90% of the value of the post office was destroyed, closing post office, laying off people, and they asked for a bailout. It was possible to manage the post office. We have 700 state-owned enterprises in South Africa, with the exception of 1 or 2. They all are not managed profitably. But it can be done. It can be done. We have evidence that it can be done. Let me give you another example. We appointed Dan Morane, the CEO, in March of this year to Eskom. We appointed Josensu Ramakgopa as the minister. And let me tell you this, when they appointed him, he made such a mess of Tshwane when he was there that I thought, this is going to be another mess. I have to say, I'm sorry, Minister, it looks a lot better. I'm not saying they solve the problem. As we sit here, they're burning diesel to keep the lights on. But the fact is, Eskom is much better managed under Dan Morane and José Ramokgopa. It is possible to manage South Africa better. And there are ample examples of that. The basis is we need economic growth. South Africa can be managed better. We have to change a few things drastically. But at the heart of it all is you have to get economic growth. Let me give you an example of somewhere where we sometimes get it wrong. And I've made this point before. Around about 700 American companies in South Africa invest here. 700 companies. By and large, they create lower middle class to higher middle class jobs. 700 of those companies. We can offend them if we want to, and they can withdraw from our economy. We can offend them enough that they remove us from the AGOA agreement. But the American economy is the only economy of the bigger economies that South Africa has a trade surplus with. In other words, we export more to them than they export to us, and that's a good thing. We also export raw materials to China, but they sell a lot more to us. In other words, money is flowing to China from South Africa as opposed to coming in. And our business with them is by and large the mining industry, where people sweat and work in almost slave-like conditions and with blood dripping from their brows to make a living. We can, in terms of geopolitics, make the right decisions, or we can make the wrong decisions. We can invest in South Africa, or we can alienate those economies in geopolitics that have a vested interest in investing in South Africa and trusting us, trusting our economy. I know you probably think, another of those white capitalists talking to me now. I'm just talking about the stats. We have to make careful decisions. And I see sometimes people refer pejoratively or in terms of a derogatory remark to the transfer of wealth from the one generation to the other one. All good economies in the world, all successful democracies, all successful liberal democracies such as South Africa based on a constitution such as ours, the main attribute of those economies is the capacity of the one generation to build a foundation in terms of what they call a demographic dividend. It's your access to capital, access to assets, good health, good education, to build on that and pass it on to the next generation. If we do not save up and pass on what we have created to the next generation, that generation must start from anew. And that's the thing in South Africa. Most of my students in my class, I know that they might be the first generation in their families who have built up something. And if they don't protect it, and if they don't develop and consolidate to the extent it can be passed on to the next generation, these scenarios, then by 2035, it will have been destroyed again. We cannot destroy the demographic dividend and the wealth that we build up when we move on to the next generation. And that's the beauty and the wonder of the idea of scenarios. It reminds us of the complexity of society, the complexity of the possible outcomes of what can happen. It reminds us how difficult it is to predict the future, how difficult it is to envisage the future, to understand the future. But unless we have these difficult conversations about which variables should be included, how should we view our partners, international partners? Who are those that, in terms of the benefit of the relationship that we have, benefit us most and benefit our children and benefit the next generation? With whom do we have exploitative relationships which assist a certain sector of the economy, but at the expense of the creation of a middle class, which is all good, liberal, democratic, established societies and good democracies have a large middle class, small group of poor people, and a little elite. Our aim is to build a middle class. And for that, you need economic growth. But I want to thank my colleagues, Professor Pach, who asked me to say just one or few words here, and then of course my colleagues who reminded us of the complexity of scenarios, the value of looking into the future, the value of trying to envisage what will assist us and what may be to our detriment. It is always a valuable intellectual exercise, and I wish more of our students could be part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. So we may end up with a scenario that incorporates all of them. That's the message I'm hearing. Is it a woodpecker? Is it a kingfisher? You know, or do we? And what is it that needs to happen for us to at least take all the positives in each scenarios? What is the role of the individual? You know, within the university, within the student governance structures, within the communities, the country, and so on? Is there a role that all of us need to play? I saw I think it's the Vulture scenario where the military, the army is the most popular or something. Is that leading to a coup or something? Are we, you know, just where we are in terms of the happening somewhere in other parts of the world? Is that where we should be going? Now, somebody may ask and say, well, 1994 to 2006-8, the environment was conducive for economic development, the growth of the economy by 4 to 5%. Maybe the environment was allowing that or conducive for that. The collapse of the economy in 2008 made things even difficult. You know, and yes, there is no replacement for that. With that, I'm asking for questions from the floor and indeed online. If there are questions, please come through. Yes, sir. Just, you can have your... yeah, please, if you can bring it here, you can, or use mine. I think the distance...
Greetings to everyone in the hall. Greetings to the esteemed guest. Ash, my question is to you, ma'am. It's a simple observation. We're drinking from different bottles of water, and yours appears to be more sophisticated than mine, going to the point of equality and inequality. However, your capacity of being here is different than mine. So how do we correct that inequality that people will see and make certain observations in their heads? That is my question.
Okay, thank you. Can we have another one so that when the responder tackles the questions, they can tackle a few, or you need an answer, then it can open others. Maybe let's take it.
Thank you very much for that, and I think I should also acknowledge the respondents for, you know, the great responses in terms of how these scenarios can be used, and especially I think in terms of student leadership, I think they took it to heart that actually, because this is also about the decisions we take today to actually change, you know, the pathway that we will follow. So if we remain with our arms folded when we can see the challenges and the stories have been told, then, you know, we will see those things emerging. And I think Prof. Krokamp also asked about whether these things can coexist, is demonstrated by the barometer in the beginning. It shows that all three scenarios can happen at the same time. It's just that one can be more amplified than the other. And that's why last year when we left, we were in a state of lawlessness. There is elements of, you know, bourgeois nation, elements of, you know, Nile walk where we're finding each other, but that's very little, there's very little spaces for those things to happen. Now, getting to the question that you ask about inequality, you know, how that can be corrected. In my personal response to that would be dependent on, you know, the type of leadership we have. And if I were to be the president today, and using this knowledge, I would look at the key driving forces, because then that gives you a shorter list of priorities. Because I think the problem with leadership today is that we've got endless priorities. And as a result, we end up not any of those. But if we were to look, especially because we've mentioned inequality as one of the key drivers before, then that would be the priority, and then two other things. But we tend to want to please everybody. It's the rural, it's the, it's the urban, it's the women, it's the LGBTQI, it's the white people, it's the middle class, and then we get caught up in that whole thing of trying to find consensus. However, if we were to make inequality a priority, because we are the most unequal nation in the world, no one beats us in inequality. Others would argue that it's because we measure, and Stats SA is very good at measuring these things, but the fact remains that you can go anywhere, they will tell you the most unequal country in the world is South Africa. So those who are in leadership, we are future leaders, and usually the trajectory from SRC, it's usually into the state corridors. So if you were to end up there, say, in the next 5 years, I would advise that actually inequality be the one non-negotiable for South Africans. We cannot simply accept it. And then you've got South Africans that live in both worlds. We live in suburbia, and then every weekend, maybe on a Sunday, I go to a Chisanyama or car wash, and I see the inequality, but yet doing nothing about it, while forgetting that even myself as the black middle class, me being in the middle class is so precarious. I can find myself on the other side in the next week or so, because as they say, us in the middle class are, 2 salaries away from poverty. So even these inequalities that we see now, it's not things that are tangible, especially for the middle class. We were talking earlier about how, as much as there's poverty in South Africa, there's great wealth in this country. We've got wealth underneath our feet in terms of our minerals, but they've become a curse. But how do we channel that wealth so that it serves the people? If you were to look at nations like Botswana, for example, they're rich in diamonds, but they make sure that those diamonds actually provide for their people, whether it's health or education, and equitably so. But in South Africa, we've sort of like retained what was happening in the past, and those who were lucky enough to move up, they're also quite comfortable there without realizing that actually they can actually, as shown in the scenarios, that we can actually be out of that. There can be a complete erosion of that middle class. So what I would say is prioritization of inequality is the biggest challenge in all our spheres, whether it's inequality in terms of access to university, inequality in terms of access to health, gender inequality, age inequality. Because if you look at even employment rates, someone my age, it's easier for them to get absorbed into the job market than someone in their 20s. That's inequality. So how do we have courageous leadership that deals with inequality head on while tapping into the great wealth that we have? Because even as individuals, we've got a few families that are very wealthy here. We've got individuals that are high net worth, with unimaginable wealth. But how does that exist within the most unequal nation in the world? So strong leadership that can compel those to actually contribute to the kitty so that we can reduce the space between haves and not haves. But it would require that, but also another thing, you said something about China, how China managed to uplift people from poverty. But also you think about our constitution. It's human rights based. Can we really apply the methodologies that are applied in China to force business or industry or those high net worth individuals to give to the nation? Can we behave like Singapore, for example? Can we behave like Kagame in Rwanda to make sure that our streets are clean and so on? It requires a bit of a stronger leadership. But then that would mean that also as citizens, we also need to let go of some things. Maybe some of our freedoms. In Rwanda, there's no freedom of speech. There's no media freedom at all. You try to be a journalist and write about the president, see what's going to happen to you. But we look to those nations. Similarly, in China, if you're accused of corruption, you're dead. But here, even with the ruling party, they'll say step aside or this and that, we tiptoe around it. So we need that strong leadership that can actually address these things head on without trying to please the whole.
Okay, great. Any other question? Yes, sir.
All right, greetings everyone. I hope that everyone is good. To our esteemed guest, this is directed to the whole panel. So my question is based on one thing that I've taken from the whole presentation, which is that this speaks to one thing, which is the one thing that's lacking in our country, which is governance, right? The backbone of everything, whether we want to do policies, whether we want to change the economy of our country, everything goes back to governance. Governance is a practice of how we apply those things. So when you look at such things as our constitution, it's one of the most diverse in the world. And when you look at our policies, our laws, the science behind them is really good, but then the practice isn't up to that measure. So how then do we make those practices better in the next coming years, so that by the time we arrive to 2035, 2036, we have really laid a good foundation for our governance in the country?
Okay, if you read the latest FATF report, that's the Financial Action Task Team that assess the South African economy on whether it's a risk to the funding of international terrorism, and also in terms of its capacity to police its financial systems. One of the complaints that they have is that we have wonderful laws in South Africa, fantastic laws. We might have bad policies sometimes, but we have fantastic laws. Our problem is with the implementation of those laws. And we've been downgraded regularly. Now we're grey listed. And it's incredible. If you look through the report, they give us a lot of credibility and credit for legislation, fantastic legislation, the most appropriate legislation. Sometimes we have the best legislation imaginable. Our financial controls of our international financial institutions are absolutely fantastic. Our banking systems and the security regimes are commendable, internationally commendable. Our ability to prosecute criminals and to impose legislation, to enforce legislation, that is where we generally are considered to be weak. Yes, we could, I just would like to say something about policy. Our policy can also undermine good legislation. About 15 to 20 years ago, South Africa had around about 1 million people working in the mining sector. Now we have 480,000 people working in the mining sector. We used to have 5% of all investment that went into prospection. What is the word of mining? I've lost that word now. Exploration, that's the bloody word I was looking for. We used to attract 5% of all international capital for exploration in our mining industry. It's now less than 1%. You have to ask yourself, and just think of the millions of people. If you lose 500,000 people, and every person is salary benefit 4 people, husband, wife, 2 children, that's a small family. Think of the people in South Africa that's unemployed, without any income, because of what's happening in the mining industry. And I've worked for Glencore for a while, and I know the people at London, and you know what they say to me? It's a simple thing. They say, we invest more than ever. We invest in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We invest in South America. More recently, Glencore sought to buy massive assets in Canada. So we do invest in the South African mining industry, but we do not invest in South Africa. And the argument is simple, and let me be honest enough. They say the minister the policies that the minister pursue makes it impossible for us to take the risk and invest the capital here. We have to look at the policies. There is still no system available that tells you who has a mining license in South Africa and what are the rules and regulations according to that. There is no system for, your word? Exploration. There is no proper system allowing for exploration in the mining industry. Do you see what policies can go bad? So the fantastic legislation that we have is meaningless if we have bad policies. And it doesn't help us at all if that legislation is not being enforced. But those are things that can be fixed. You will have noticed, and when the government of national unity was introduced, literally a week or two later, suddenly we saw inflow in the investment portfolio of South Africa. Suddenly companies invested a little bit more. On the basis of what? They trust that maybe the government will pursue different policies if they have to reach compromises with the opposition parties as opposed to pursuing it on their own. Just that need to distribute authority, the likeliness of good governance that come about as a consequence of the distribution of authority, induced a degree of trust which led to an inflow of capital. And let me tell you this, an inflow of capital means jobs, growth, opportunities, growing in the middle class. That's what you need. We need more trust in our economy, more inflow, trust in our policies, trust in our systems, and our ability to actually enforce our legislation. One last thing. I found it absolutely astonishing. The DA this week announced that they are offended by the Minister of Labour who wants to appoint 2,000 inspectors to see if the equity legislation in South Africa is being followed. He said, oh, they're going to destroy thousands of jobs. I find it curious. So sometimes legislation must be, the law is there. So sometimes the law must be enforced and sometimes not. Suddenly they preach for laws not being enforced. That's what the minister wants to do. If they want to change something, try to change the legislation, but you cannot now claim that you support legislation, you support good governance, you support the justice system, but when it doesn't suit your policies, now suddenly you are against that policy being implemented. But those are the type of contradictions that we have in South Africa, which discourage people with money to come to South Africa. People always, I often hear people say we have a lot of money. We have a lot of money, but not money prepared to take a risk. And that's what we need. We need money that's prepared to take a risk in South Africa as opposed to taking that risk somewhere else, another part of the world, to Canada, to DRC, or to South America. But it's a good question. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you very much. I think we are now 12:05. We had promised we will be out here by 12. Time flies. I think we must have the vote of thanks. But the Indlulamithi SA Scenarios has a website. Please go there, and also on the digital media platforms, X, Facebook. Please continue the discussions. And I think these are discussions that as a country we must have to avoid the vulture culture and other cultures that are detrimental to our growth. So please, thank you very much. And Prof, are you ready?
Colleagues, my task is simple, just to thank each one of you for being here, to thank our colleagues from Indlulamithi SA Trust, and the panelists, the SRC, the SCC, for really gracing the occasion. Prof. Grokamp, thank you, sir. Professor Chalufu, in his absence, our Deputy Dean, she was online. She was supposed to do this, but we used the wrong type of connection, so she can't speak from YouTube line. Professor Hekelin Kotze. I think, colleagues, the purpose has been achieved, just to spark some debates, to understand that to be associated with Northwest University, there's a higher calling to think better and act better, to imagine the country the continent and the world we want to achieve. And so I look forward to more engagements, especially from the student leadership, on these kinds of models and figurative kind of speaking and metaphors to say, what will be our role and our contribution? So these are works that are looking at South Africa in the future, and I like the fact that they actually make even specific dates, that by 2035. So you also need to imagine yourself, many of you, in 2035. So I was talking to the program director, and thanks to you, sir, as well, that where will you be in 2035? Alive, retired? If you are lucky, you will be dead, right? So you need to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that when we build the country, so the question about governance, public policy, these are very complex conversations. We can take years and decades to really make sense of a very small contribution. But I think what the Indlulamithi team is trying to say is, if we build our public institutions, our municipalities, our provincial governments departments, our national government departments, our state-owned enterprises, our public sectors, if we contribute meaningfully with our skills, with proper people in their respective places, public leaders who are interested in resolving public leadership problems. And they were very specific that you do not go there and represent your political party interests over community interest. And this is what we have seen happening over and over again. So it is the challenge for us now, but it also remains a challenge for the future of our country, and say, what do we represent? So I look forward to meet you in future as alumni of Northwest University and ask you these critical questions from the Indlulamithi scenario. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm not sure if the presentation is shareable. We can share, yeah, especially with the student leadership, so they can continue the debate in their societies and other spaces. Thank you very much, everyone. Much appreciated. Have a good day.